And we are back on the 0 Hour. Joining us now is a good friend of the program and a good keyboard player, Cole Stangler, staff writer for In These Times. Cole, thanks for coming back on the show.
Always a pleasure, RJ.
You bet. A pleasure to have you too. So listen, you went to the People's Climate March and the one that was even closer to my heart, I think, the Flood Wall Street March the next day. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about it. First of all, I wanted to ask, well, let's start with the People's Climate March. Obviously got a lot of coverage. Did we ever get a final, do you know, did we ever get a final count of the number of folks that were there?
So during the day, organizers estimated this was during the March. Well, actually, leading up to it, they said 100,000 would be successful for them. They're expecting 100,000, and then initially they said 310,000, and then that got revised a step further to 400,000. That was what Time Magazine reported. A number of different outlets. So it's we'll never know exactly how many people showed up, but that's kind of the art of protest.
Right.
It's estimates all the time, but 400,000 seems to be the figure organizers are going with, and you know, if that's correct, that's a big deal. That's a really big deal.
Well, even to get close to it and to have Time Magazine accept it, look, it was hundreds of thousands. I mean, that's approaching the number of people that went to Central Park to hear Simon and Garfunkel, and they didn't even have to hear the Feel and Groovy songs. So, no, I don't,
Yeah,
I don't want, I don't want complaints from Simon and Garfunkel fans now, but that's a lot of people. And you quote somebody, a student at Swarthmore, saying, "I feel so tiny right now, but I feel like I'm a part of something huge." I love that quote because that is, exactly what a great movement should be about. So turnout was great. How about and you had some, as you mentioned, and others did, high profile public officials, the New York City Mayor, Bill de Blasio, the UN
yeah.
General,
I mean, just yeah, just to keep harping on the turnout number. I mean, if you think just 400,000 people, it's not just the biggest environmental protest in history. That they beat that by a long shot. So in world history, the biggest environmental protest. That's one thing. Second thing is, if you want to put that in context with other big mobilizations in American history, 400,000 people is like, that's all. The March on Washington in 1963 was around 250,000, so it's bigger than that. 1.5 times bigger than that. Where it's right up there with some of the biggest anti-war demonstrations in, the Vietnam War and the Iraq War, which are, as of today, the biggest demonstrations in American history, in American political history. So, just from a purely historical perspective, that's a lot of people. So I think that shouldn't be underestimated. That was the main goal of organizers, was to get as many people possible out there. Um,
right.
and
And
yeah,
so,
I mean or sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, obviously you're talking about demonstrations that had a huge impact on history and on culture and on American politics, including at least one that had a 14-year-old me in the reflecting pool. So, uh, yeah, these were important, and I guess that gets me to my next question for you, which is a huge turnout. But then I think back and remember that the first Earth Day celebration, for example, a lot of people came out, including the then President of the United States, Richard Nixon. I mean, to be a little bit, just to, probe a little bit, I guess. Was there anything about this that while you were there, you felt it could be a transformative moment in the sense that it would change people's attitudes about what's driving climate problems?
There were a lot of critiques about this demonstration, about some of the people who endorsed it, some of the organizations. That was one major critique. The other one is, as you're saying, what's the actual impact? We can get a lot of people to come out, and then so what? What does that mean? I think as organizers pointed out, the 350.org, the group that Bill McKibben co-founded. I was talking to one of the organizers there. They organize this heavily, and she said, "Look, I mean, mass mobilizations have a particular function, which is we don't pretend like it's going to change things overnight, but it's a way to get a lot of people together to, build camaraderie. That's one thing. A lot of the people that came out to the demonstration are working in different parts of the country. They're isolated from each other. They're working on small campaigns in West Virginia, in California, in New York, and this is a way for them to network and to feel good about themselves, basically. So that's really important. And the other thing is, just the headline grabbing capacity of it is a big deal. And I don't think, despite what maybe some of the defenders of the march would say publicly, I think everyone knows that this is not going to change anything overnight. I don't think people even thought that this was going to have an immediate impact on even the UN negotiations that day. Maybe this is my own cynical take, but I don't even think that people thought it was going to have an immediate impact on the negotiations that day. So it's a very long process, and I think part of it is just catapulting climate in the news. And by the looks of it, and to some degree I'm isolated by this because I follow this stuff very closely, but by the looks of it, the mainstream press was reporting and talking about this. They covered the UN summit earlier this week. They covered the march, right? It was on the front page of the New York Times. Obama the other day just announced that he's creating or expanding reserves in the Pacific Ocean to make it the biggest natural preserve in the world right now. So, yeah, I mean, I on the one hand, I share your skepticism, as I think everyone does. On the other, I don't think we should pretend like this march is going to fix everything overnight. I don't think organizers like that.
Right, and I get that, and I think that's good and balanced, but fair and balanced. But one aspect of this that didn't get a lot of coverage, and I don't know if this was something you looked into or not, but they also said they were going to have what would you call them, sympathy strikes or allied strikes around the world in other countries. And I did see a lot of coverage of this, as you mentioned, but I didn't see a lot of coverage of these other events in other countries. Did you hear anything about that?
I don't know if the American press was all that interested in them. There was an action in Paris. There was something in London. There was stuff in India. So it happened. It didn't get a lot of coverage, though. You're right about that, at least in the United States.
So I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you is that, I really liked your piece on it. I read a lot of pieces about it, and your piece gave a good feeling about it. But I mean, to go back to the language of those old Vietnam demonstrations, I'm just curious to know from your point of view, what was the vibe, for lack of a better words? I mean, what was the feeling in the air when you were there?
There were a lot of different contingents, and that's not a cop out answer. It's just the fact that it really depended on where you were. I mean, this was enormous. Not to overstate the point, but it was like 30 blocks up and down. Anyone knows New York City, from the march officially started at Columbus Circle, went up 30 blocks up to around the lower 80s, just all along Central Park West. And so I kind of walked around up and down that, those 30 blocks to get a sense of what it was like. And it really depended. There was, at the front of the march they had indigenous groups, frontline communities. They had a more family-friendly section. The whole march was family-friendly, but one specifically geared towards families. And so it was strollers, with kids and babies and dogs. Then there was a section where students were marching. There was a section where there were divestment people, a lot of youth who were connecting it obviously to divestment, chanting the names of their respective organizations. There were obviously towards the back the radical anti-capitalist groups who were chanting about ending capitalism, connecting the climate crisis to the economic system we live under. There were some black bloc people who I'm sure were skeptical of the fact that they were marching in, side Al Gore and Ban Ki-moon, Leonardo DiCaprio in the front of the march. So again, it really was this is what happens when you have a mass mobilization. You have this, almost contradictory crew of participants where Ban Ki-moon is marching alongside someone from the Anarchist Alliance of Washington D.C., for instance. So it really, I think it really depended on, and then that was one of the things too, a consistent message. There was the main message, which we want climate action, but to be be blunt about it, you could walk up and down and see that people had different messages. I saw a variety of different slogans, people concerned about fracking, people wanting divestment, people wanting to stop horse abuse, people wanting to legalize marijuana. Not to get that you get that at every demonstration, but there were a lot of calls, and I think the fact that I think the fact that there wasn't a list of demands, perpetuated that.
Right. And of course you do, and you get this when you get that many people together. Well, we're going to go to a break in a couple minutes, and then after that, we're going to talk about the demonstration the next day. But yeah, a couple minutes. So, what? But I guess what I would close out this segment by asking is, did you have fun?
Yeah, I think it was a lot of fun. It felt like a festival. There were marching bands there, a lot of noise, and I sympathize, to an extent. I'm a reporter. I was covering it. I wasn't actively demonstrating, but I think for a lot of people who care about the climate, the person I quoted from Swarthmore, her words ring true, which is that, it doesn't get a lot of coverage, and now people who are demonstrating felt less alone. I mean, when you're marching with that many people, it's hard not to feel some sense of solidarity and camaraderie. So I think that sense was very powerful.
Now, you also had some good conversations, and if we have a chance after the break, we'll get back into. You had some good conversations with the organizers at Avaz and 350.org. But in the 40 seconds we got left, did you have any sense? Are they working on follow up already? Do they have some concrete ideas for where to go from here?
I don't think they're planning another major demonstration like this for a while. I think that they're continuing the campaigns they're working on, which is 350 has been pressing very hard on the divestment campaign, and that's gaining momentum. We saw just a couple days after the march, the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, ironically, which maybe not ironically, made its fortune off of Standard Oil, the infamous oil company, is now divesting its holdings from fossil fuels. That was a big victory.
Yeah, and I think this kind of thing is huge because the South African victory had a lot to do with divestment too. So I think it's a great strategy. And speaking of divestment, obviously we're dealing with the financial aspect of climate change, and that gets us to the demonstration that happened the next day, which is the flood Wall Street demonstration, which you also covered. So when we come back from this break, I'm going to want to talk to you a little bit about that. We're talking with Cole Stangler, staff writer for In These Times, and a good friend of our program about the demonstrations in New York, climate demonstrations. We will be right back after this with more with Cole Stangler on the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour with me bumping the microphone. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we are talking with Cole Stangler, staff writer for In These Times. Cole, you did go to the Flood Wall Street movement also, right?
I did. I was there.
And so what'd you think? Now, my take was, obviously I come at things from an economic and financial point of view a lot of the time, not all of the time. But I wrote a big thing supporting the Flood Wall Street. I wasn't able to attend either march, but basically saying, and I'm not asking you to opine, you're a reporter, but I feel as if in many ways Wall Street and the kind of investment capitalism it practices makes it the epicenter of the environmental crisis because we've got so many financial motives to pollute or to use fossil fuels or to do other things that harm the economy, and there's no incentive in the current system to avoid that. So I thought that just from a structural point of view, the Flood Wall Street demonstration made a lot of sense to me and had a higher level of, maybe not a perfect level, but a higher level of specificity. But obviously it was much smaller and very different. What was your impression of that, especially coming off of the 400,000 person People's Climate March?
Well, yeah, as you pointed out, there was a big difference in the demonstrations. So on the one hand, you had the big 400,000 person one. The march was permitted for one. That's the big legal difference. So the organizers had applied for permits beforehand. So the police knew the route, and everyone was walking down the same route, and there were no surprises. On the other hand, the Flood Wall Street demonstration was not permitted. That's one major difference, which means that the police were scrambling and awaiting what organizers were going to do and what protesters were going to do. And so people gathered in Battery Park in Lower Manhattan, and there were probably only a handful of people who knew exactly where we were going. And the march, so there was a little rally in Battery Park, and then there was a kind of chaotic, it was a chaotic kind of scramble to Wall Street, in which I think organizers were making on-the-fly decisions about where to go, because the police were responding on the fly as well, and we kind of traveled, like the names of the streets, but this very chaotic dash through Lower Manhattan till eventually everyone settled around the intersection where the Wall Street Bull is, which I think is Broadway and Pine Street, if I'm not mistaken. So people flooded the streets there, both sides of that intersection, and sat down in the street. And like the other demonstration, it was a festival. It was a different kind of festival. It was more radical. The chants were more radical. I think one of the great props they had was a giant inflatable balloon that had the words carbon bubble painted on it. And this thing was massive, and people were, as I said, just carrying it through the streets, weaving their way in through buses and cars and the police. And at one point, which made for very good symbolism, this is a hard bubble to keep control of, and so it exploded beyond barricades that had been set up around the bull. The police didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but they knew something was going to happen, so the bull area was barricaded, and the ball flew over the street into this barricaded off area where the Wall Street Bull was, where the
Cole, we're losing you. We're losing you there. I don't know why, but we're getting.
Okay.
Yeah, you're cutting in and out. But the last we heard, the climate bubble ball, which sounds like something out of a Pink Floyd concert, flew into the bull. Which I've always said they built that bull because they haven't gotten around to constructing the golden calf yet. But so it flew into the bull, and which was barricaded. Okay, I didn't know that.
And the NYPD popped the carbon bubble, which made for some sad symbolism, deflating the balloon. So I think that could well be the most iconic image, if it were not for another image, which I think may even be more iconic, which is there was a guy who was dressed up in a very lifelike polar bear costume, almost eerily lifelike. I don't know where the costume came from. At any rate, when the day was over, people were sitting in the street. There were about 100 people left by the end of the day, thinned down from about 1,000. 100 people were willing to risk arrest. And there's a photo of the NYPD cuffing the polar bear with his hands behind his back in the full polar bear costume with the head on as well, being cuffed and whisked away. Which, if you're wearing a polar bear to a demonstration, then a polar bear costume, then that's the kind of image you're looking for.
Right. No.
Now, it's a good street theater. Yeah.
Right. Now he's not just an endangered species; he's an endangered species with a rap sheet. And demonstrators were, they were told to wear blue to flood Wall Street, which is appropriate because if climate change goes unchecked by the end of this century, Wall Street and most of Manhattan below 34th Street will in fact be underwater. So the demonstrators, most people wore blue. I understand that the New York City cops wore blue too. Is that correct?
They did, as always.
Excellent. I guess the keynote speaker, you had Chris Hedges, you had a couple other folks, good people, but I understand that really it was Naomi Klein that was the headliner, and you've read her book. You've read her new book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. I have not, but clearly she agrees with my thesis that Wall Street is the epicenter of the environmental crisis, or it suggests she does anyway. I really haven't, I intend to read it. But you're a fan of, do you think it's a good book?
Yeah, I thought it was, on balance, a very good book. I read a review of it over in these times as well. She did speak, and a lot of people really appreciate what she's brought to the movement. If you want to talk about the book just beforehand, I think it's important, she's played a pretty substantial role in this, is that she's been kind of a bridge between the more radical types, the anti-capitalist types, and then the quote-unquote mainstream or the NGO environmental groups. and that she's done an excellent job, I think, of trying to bridge that divide of making. By bridging, I mean, I think by putting pressure on and connecting the quote unquote big green groups. Again, not don't want to overstate how big they are, but putting pressure on those groups to take direct action, to sympathize, and to endorse more radical demonstrations. I talked to the head of the Sierra Club, and 10 years ago it would have been unimaginable for the head of the Sierra Club to back a radical direct action at Wall Street, calling to overthrow capitalism, right? And
Right.
he wasn't at the demonstration, but he thought he thought it was a great idea. He was all on board with it. So, anyways, to get too sidetracked, but a role there in
Okay.
helping to bridge these two camps.
Okay. Well,
Um,
that's good to know. And
yeah,
I take it that her talk basically summarized the thesis of the book, which is that capitalism as it exists. Well, you tell me the thesis of the book. You read it. I didn't.
I think the central thesis of the book is that there's this contradiction, if you will, this irresolvable tension between the future of the planet and the capital of underway. And she sees, and that causes her to believe that the way forward to achieve climate justice is by not catering or cozying up to the big economic interests that control economic activity, but rather to build, for lack of a better word, counter hegemonic movement that fights those economic structures that are responsible for the crisis. So that sounds really theoretical, but in practice, it means instead of
What?
trying to work hand in hand with big leaders, with big oil, with gas companies, majority of
Yeah.
elected representatives, we need to have movements from that.
Well, Cole, you're breaking up again. So I get we get the
Sorry, yeah.
idea. Yeah, it's. I'm glad that both demonstrations happened. I'm glad that you were there to cover them, and looking forward. Hopefully, you'll come back on the show sometime soon. But thanks again for joining us on the show.
All right. Thanks so much, RJ. Sorry about the signal there.
No problem. Okay, we will be right back after this with more on the real situation with the climate. I'm Richard R. Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.